verses 28 and 29. We want to read, and God blessed them. That, of course, is man and woman. God blessed them, and God said, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth." And God said, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that's on the face of the earth, and every tree with its seed for fruit. You shall have them for food." So here's this idea of dominion being given to mankind. Humanity received dominion. The Lord committed the world that He had made, particularly the creatures that He had made and the plants that He had made, all of its resources, to the dominion of mankind. What does that mean? What's it mean to have dominion? Anybody have any thoughts about that? Okay. Control and the authority to use it. Any other thoughts? Okay, a manager. What are some other synonyms that we might use? Would it be fair to say sovereign potentate? Is that the same thing as receiving dominion? Or would it be more fair to say something like overseer? And what's the difference between those things? And that's really what we're going to get at in the discussion tonight. That's the point of this. And this is kind of one of the history classes I took when I was in college. We took a final exam at the beginning of the semester, and we took a final exam at the end of the semester, and that was our grade. And I didn't do too well on the first one, but I hadn't studied everything yet. The point of it was to find out what we knew about the subject before we started. That's kind of the point of that question. Hopefully our grasp of what the Scriptures mean when it says, okay, we've made male and female, and I'm going to give them dominion over things, exactly what that means. Before we get into that discussion, I'll ask another question. Why? Why was the man and woman given dominion over these things? The two verses leading up to this all center around one thing, essentially. Right. He made man in His image and His likeness, and so the male and female, them, He made them. That's where that statement ends. Male and female, He created them. Both are created in the image of God. They receive dominion over the rest of creation because of that unique aspect of their creation. They're like God in some way. And I would suggest to you that there's actually something that we're supposed to learn from this process. If we grasp and understand what it means to be exercising dominion over the fish and over the birds and over the creatures and over the plants, if we understand what that means, we start to understand our relationship with God better. See, this is a tool, a very practical way for God to teach us about His relationship to us. And so we have to think about that. That comes into play. That's the reason dominion was given. Who gave the dominion? God. So God granted it. Would they have had this dominion had God not granted it? So if this was what our Bibles read, I want you to think about this for a minute. If this is what it read, and God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, the living livestock according to their kinds, everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind, and God saw that it was good. That's verse 25. Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let them have... And all that from that point on is not in the Bible. God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness. And then the next thing it said, and God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply. Would man have dominion over everything if it was never granted by God? And the answer to that is no. And that's an important thing to keep in mind, because what does that mean about our dominion over the animals and our dominion over the birds and our dominion over the fish? Does it arise inherently from within us? And the answer to that is no, it does not. It doesn't just happen because we're somehow greater than they are. We have that dominion because the one who actually possesses it gave it to us to exercise. So what does that make us? That's what we have to start asking ourselves. And that's where the distinction starts to come into play. God granted dominion, but He did not grant sovereignty. Well, yeah. All of this shoots a big hole in evolution. The sovereignty of God, the absolute right to rule, the right to... What do sovereigns have the right to do? What do sovereigns do? They make laws. Sovereignty rests in God, not in man. The right to set the order of things, the right to say who's in charge. We don't have the right to say who's in charge. God retains that authority. God retains the authority to make law. God retains absolute control. By the way, this is kind of a side note to a side note. Could God compel us to do what He wants us to do? Could He make it so that we must comply? So the fact that He allows us to exercise our own will demonstrates what about God? This is an important lesson. It demonstrates that God is not a control freak, like many people are. We don't like to cede control of anything that we have control over, and we don't want anyone to deviate from what we want. My grandmother, and I loved her, but when I cut her grass, she used to stand in the yard watching me and barking out orders if it wasn't done exactly the way she wanted it done. You know how I get around that? I just don't let anybody else cut my grass. I do it myself. But she did. She stood out there in the yard. No. You go this way, and you go this way, and you do it this way, and you don't turn that way. Hold it this way. Use this machine. She had specific machines to use in certain areas of her house. The front yard and side yard had to be done with an electric push mower. The only thing you could do with the riding mower was the back. It had to be cut a certain direction. It had to be cut a certain height. You actually had to approach it from the right place. You had to start in the right place, go the right direction, turn at the right time. It all mattered to her, and she never relinquished. She wouldn't just send you out there and let you do it. She would make sure you did it the way that she believed was right. Could God manage our lives that way? Yes, He could. The very fact that He doesn't tells us something about the way that He exercises His sovereignty. If that's the way He exercises His sovereignty, and our control is merely dominion that arises from His sovereignty, how should we act? You remember that parable that Jesus taught about the man who had a servant who owed him money? And he came to him and pled and said, I can't pay you back. And the slave's owner says, don't worry about it, your debt's forgiven. And then he went out and had someone that owed him money thrown into jail. What then did the owner of the servant do? He called him back in and said, hey, wait a minute. If that's the way you're going to treat them, then that's what I'm doing to you as well. There's a lesson in that. And it's about us and about how we use the authority that God gives us. It's about whether or not we're willing to forgive the way that He has been willing to forgive us. It's about whether or not we exercise the authority that we're given the way that He would have it exercised. And if we abuse that authority, then He is going to do what? Wherewith the measure in which you judge another, that measure will be meted out to you. In other words, you're going to get the same kind of compassion from God that you have shown with the authority. In other words, you're going to be judged based upon whether you've abused the authority God's given you. Why all that is true is twofold. Number one, because God retains His sovereignty. He's actually in control. Because He gave us dominion doesn't mean that we get to do whatever we want to do and we don't have to answer to anybody. That's what sovereign potentates have, is the right to not have to answer to anybody. We've simply been given dominion to exercise underneath the sovereign rule of God, which we will answer for. And we have the example of a being that has the right to demand and control the actions of all of His creation, and yet He allows us to make choices and control things for ourselves. And if He's going to allow us that kind of freedom, what should our attitude toward the authority that He gives us be? We have to ask those kind of questions. And think about what it means for, okay, God has set an example about how to exercise authority over someone. Do I have the right to expect more of my children than God expects of me? Do I have a right to set a higher standard for my children and hold them of greater account to me than I expect God to hold me to Him? And there's all kinds of relationships we can talk about with respect to that. And the answer is no. That's the overwhelming teaching throughout the entire Bible, is that we answer to God. And if God's willing to forgive us, we ought to be willing to do what? Forgive others. And if we refuse to forgive others, what's going to happen? Go back and study the Lord's teaching. Forgive us our debts as we forgive those who've trespassed against us. What happens if we don't forgive? Are we going to be forgiven if we refuse to forgive? No. Because we don't have the right to expect others to live up to a higher standard than the standard that the sovereign God has placed. We have dominion in some cases, but dominion that is governed by the laws of God, not dominion that allows me to exercise and create law. And that gets to the distinction that we want to make between dominion and sovereignty in this context. A sovereign possesses the autonomous right to make law. Those with dominion merely have the right to lead or to guide or to execute, however you want to talk about it. It doesn't matter which one of those words you choose, to execute the legitimate laws that the sovereign has handed down.
To me, it all kind of comes back down to one thing about the whole crux of the matter is the dominion, the authority, and everything else comes down to the control of one, of self.
Okay. I agree. I agree. By the way, that's the person we are least likely to try to exercise authority over is ourselves. We give ourselves all kind of liberty. And then we try to impose our will upon other people. And that is someone that doesn't understand these basic principles. Mr. John first and then Josh.
On that same matter, just because when He gave us that dominion, we thought, why? Because He also gave us the free will to do as we please. We may not follow His rules, God's law, His commandments, but He don't want you, if you're not going to do that, if you're not going to use the free will to want, it'll up come to Him, and He's not going to have you anyway.
Yeah, there's... And let's back up just a little bit before Josh makes his comment. Do I have authority over myself?
You have the free will to exercise.
Okay, so I have free will, which makes me a self-autonomous being. I get to choose what I do and what I don't do and all that kind of good stuff. I have that. But does that authority arise from within myself? No, God gave it to me. So I need to understand that even the exercising of the authority over myself is going to be judged by God. It ultimately resides in Him. He didn't cede His sovereignty over His creation. He gave us a role to play as stewards over His creation. There's another one of those synonyms we can use, like overseer or manager. We're not owners. We're working for the owner. We don't even own ourselves. We didn't give ourselves life. Who gave us life? God. I didn't will myself to be here. There were a few times when I was a teenager, I actually wished I had never been brought into this world. It was more trouble than I wanted to deal with. I didn't ask for this. On those days, by the way, I understood how Job felt. When he said it'd be better if I hadn't been born. Because that's exactly how I felt at the time. I didn't ask to be here. I didn't ask to be a person. I didn't ask to be in this place. I didn't ask to have this body. I didn't ask to be this tall. I didn't ask to be any of these things. I was just given these things and made a steward over this life. And as a steward over this life, I'm going to answer for the way that I exercise authority over it. That's just talking about me as an individual. Now, it gets even more scary when you as an individual are then told, okay, not only do you have authority over yourself, but now you're going to have authority over this as well. Here's something else that I own. I want you to look after it too. Do you notice the word that I chose? Look after it. Because that's what we're doing when we exercise dominion. Not exercising control, but looking after, caring for, providing for, protecting, guarding, preserving something that belongs to someone else. That's what happens when we understand that God has sovereignty. And He wrote it into the law too. Turn to Leviticus 25. We want to start reading in verse 23. There's a weird thing about property law under the law of Moses. Now, the lead into this is, how did Israel gain control over the land of Judah? God gave it to them. God said, I've got this land I'm going to give you. And He had them go in and take it. They were supposed to clear out all the previous occupants. They didn't do a very good job of that. That came back to bite them later. That's another story. But then He actually said, okay, this is how it's going to break down. This tribe gets this portion of land, and this tribe gets this portion of land, and this tribe gets this portion of land. And He actually Walked it all through. It told them exactly where the borders were going to be. And it went down to the family level, was broken down by family. And so here is my little Jewish family, and we own this little piece of land in this region of Judah that was given to us by God to care for, to oversee, and to use. And this is my property, right? So I can sell my property, can't I? One of the things that makes property rights is the fact that I have the right to use them or sell them, except for listen to what he said to them. Leviticus 25 and verse 23, the land shall not be sold in perpetuity. Anybody? John should know what the word perpetuity means. He was in the land business long enough to know that. What's he mean? The land shall not be sold in perpetuity. Forever. I can't just sell you my land and it's forever yours. That's not how this works. The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine, God said. You see, God didn't relinquish ownership of this land. He was letting them use it. The land belonged to God. The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. You're strangers and sojourners with me. I own this land. This is my property. You're a sojourner on my property. I'm letting you use my property. And he's even going to let them sell it in a limited way. But he's telling them you don't have the right to control it because you don't own it. I do. And I didn't relinquish my ownership just because I gave you the land. In all the country you possess, you shall allow a redemption of the land. If your brother becomes poor and sells part of his property, then his nearest redeemer shall come and redeem what his brother has sold. Okay, I'm out of money. I need something to eat. I sell a piece of property. There was someone assigned the task of coming back and buying that property. Listen to what he goes on to say. If a man has no one to redeem it, and then himself becomes prosperous and finds sufficient means to redeem it, let him calculate the years since he sold it and pay back the balance of the man whom he sold it to, and then return his property. If he does not have sufficient means to recover it, then what he sold shall remain in the hand of the buyer until the year of Jubilee. In the Jubilee it shall be released, and he shall return his property. And so there was somebody in my family whose duty it was to buy it back. If they couldn't buy it back, then it could be held by the person I sold it to until I prospered enough that I had money to buy it back. And if that never happened, then when the Jubilee year rolled around, it automatically reverted back to me, to the person that God gave it to. This whole process was demonstrating that God was still the one in control. That it was His land, that you were simply stewards of the land, users of the land, protectors of the land. Yes, you could use it to grow crops on. Yes, you could use it to raise livestock on. Yes, you could even sell it if that's what you had to do in order to get what you needed. But he's saying, listen, just because you chose to sell it doesn't mean that it doesn't still belong to you, because I'm the one that chose for your family to have this land. What happened if Jubilee rolled around 6 months after you sold it? Tough luck. By the way, that became a problem later. There had to be follow-up instructions to them saying, hey, you can't say, well, I'm not going to buy from this person that needs me to buy this land just because Jubilee is close by. This was a way for God to help people get what they needed and preserve their well-being. And so we see that God built into the law, when it came to land possession, this idea of possession and authority over something that was distinct from sovereignty over it. And anybody that lived in Louisiana very long might understand that it's very similar to the way we treat minerals that are in the ground in this state. If you're from anywhere else, you've heard of people owning mineral rights to land. There is no such thing as owning minerals in the state of Louisiana while they're in the ground. They have to be out of the ground before anybody can possess them. And the person that owns the land doesn't own the minerals. He has a mineral servitude, which gives him the dominion over extracting those minerals. He gets to control if they're taken out of the ground, if they're not taken out of the ground. Usually what happens in the state of Louisiana is what? That servitude is leased to someone. So I have a tract of land. It's believed that there's minerals underneath it. There's an oil or gas company somewhere that wants those minerals. They come to me and they say, let's write out this lease, and we're going to lease your mineral servitude, and we're going to go in and extract those minerals. But there's a neat little part of Louisiana law that says if that servitude goes unused, after 10 years, guess who it reverts back to? The landowner. Now that only comes into play if I sell a piece of land but say, hey, I'm keeping my mineral servitude. And then if I don't use that, it goes to the person who actually bought the land. All of this is the same thing. We don't possess ownership of minerals when they're in the earth in Louisiana. They belong to the earth. In all truthfulness, because of the history of this state and where it came from, they actually probably were viewed as being belonging to God. Because this comes out of the code that comes out of our connection to French law, and the church was pretty powerful there. It's also why we have parishes and not counties. But anyway, the point is the same. Having dominion over something, being able to say, yes, I want it drilled and taken out, or no, I don't want it drilled and taken out. Having the dominion and the control over something and the ownership of it are two separate things. And that is the same thing when you talk about any kind of authority, over anything on this earth. And no matter who you're talking about. Where does the government get its right to make laws? God. Where does a husband get his authority over his wife? God. So it's defined not by what the husband wants, but it's defined by what? The limits that God has placed on it. Does the husband have the right to beat his wife? I don't read that anywhere in the Bible. In fact, I read the exact opposite. Does the husband have the right to kill his wife? Nope. Wait a minute. I thought he had control over her. I thought he had dominion. I thought he was the head. No. She belongs to God. That relationship is sanctioned by God, and what you have is a role to preserve and protect and care and oversee and provide for. Same thing with parents and children. Who do those children belong to? It makes an effective and emotional way to control children at times, to say, I brought you into this world and I can take you out the same way I brought you into it. The fact of the matter is, I didn't bring them into the world and I can't take them out, and if I do, I've done something wrong. Why? Because they don't belong to me, they belong to God. I've simply been made a steward over them. And I'm going to answer to God for the way I do that. I don't have absolute authority. I don't have sovereign control. I have dominion that was given by God and is expected to be exercised in a particular way. And we have to think about that and think about what that means. Leadership that stems from dominion isn't like a king. Leadership that stems from dominion is like a shepherd. Which is why that language is used all over the Bible. The Bible is just full of the imagery of shepherding in terms of leadership. The political leaders of Israel were talked about in terms of being shepherds. Overseers of local churches talked about in terms of being shepherds. Even the sovereign King of Kings and Lord of Lords is said to be the chief shepherd of the church. Leadership that stems from dominion is not authoritative control. It's not dictatorial. It's not lawmaking. It's preserving, it's caring for, it's keeping, it's all sorts of things like that. But it all arises from discharging responsibilities under the lawmaker, not exercising authority. And if people understood that, there would be a lot less problems in the world. I'm convinced there'd be a lot less wars in the world. Wars are fought because people want control. You got a comment, Mr. John?
Yeah, one thing to me, a little bit, maybe a little funnier, government don't get their authority from God. They should, but they don't.
Well,
It comes from you and I.
I understand what you're saying.
Our government would be a perfect, would be absolutely perfect world if they would.
Right. I understand exactly what you're saying. But what I would say, I'd say it a little bit different than you. I'd say they get their authority from God, but they are misusing it, and they are eventually going to be called into account for it. I don't know when, I don't know where, I don't know how. I'll be honest with you, I hope I don't have to live through it. Because the ones I read about in the Bible are usually not fun. Because what he normally does is raises up another government somewhere else and lets them get powerful and strong, and then says, go take them. And it's not fun to live through that. Never was fun to live through that. The people who had it the best in those circumstances were the ones who got drug off 1,000 miles from home and made slaves. Those are the lucky ones. The rest of them died, or worse, lived in horrible conditions, wishing they were dead. Turn to Isaiah chapter 40, if you will. Isaiah 40. We want to read verses 9 through 11 of Isaiah 40. Go up on a high mountain, O Zion, herald of good news. Lift your voice with strength, O Jerusalem, herald of good news. Lift it up, fear not. Say to the cities of Judah, behold your God. Behold, the Lord God comes with might, and his arm rules for him. Behold, his reward is with him, and his recompense before him. Look at verse 11 real close. He will tend his flock like a shepherd. He will gather the lambs in his arms. He will carry them in his bosom and gently lead those that are with young. This is messianic in its nature. It's talking about the rule and authority of Christ. Behold your God. And then says he's going to rule like a shepherd. And defines that. He's going to tend his flock like a shepherd. Notice the language, tend. What does that word mean, tend his flock? You have to exercise care for them, to provide for them, to feed them, to water them, to make sure that they have pasture, to make sure that they're protected, to make sure they have everything that they need to grow and to prosper and to get fat and to do what sheep are supposed to do. He'll gather the lambs in his arms. Intimate care. Gently lead them in his bosom. What does it mean to be in the bosom of the shepherd? You ever notice that I don't even know who painted it. I really don't. It may be a Rembrandt. It may be one of those other guys. There's a picture of what's supposed to be Jesus that I've seen a gazillion times where he's holding this little baby lamb. Seems like he's got this like red robe on and he's holding this little white lamb, and that's what it means to be carried in the bosom of the Lord. Do you realize that there are people out there that treat their pet cats and pet dogs that way, but not their neighbors? They'll steal from their neighbors. They'll cut their kids off. Or worse, let their kids run around and do whatever they want to do and not provide anything for them. And hold the little dog the whole time. Yes, ma'am. Yep. My favorite is that it's a federal crime to mess with an eagle egg. Okay, I'm not even telling you to do anything, W. If you touch it, you've broken a federal law. Because that egg may one day be a living eagle. But the child in a mother's womb is not protected. That's one of the things that I believe is going to end up being the basis for God's judgment against the governing authorities, who are not using the authority that God gave them to preserve His people the way that they ought to. People belong to God. I don't have a right to abuse someone that belongs to God. Nor do I have a right to own someone that belongs to God. If I understand this, that doesn't become a problem. Because I realize, wait a minute, I don't have the right to own something that God hasn't given me the right to own. I don't have the right to control something that God hasn't given me the right to control. I don't have the right to demand things that God hasn't given me the right to demand. I don't have a right to create law that God hasn't given me the right to create. There could be benevolent kings in this world, people who had absolute control in their land, if they governed understanding that God's laws limited what they were allowed to do and directed what they should do. Unfortunately, they don't view themselves as shepherd, they view themselves as being served by people. One of the things that we're most proud of in our nation is the fact that we don't have a king. When they settled on the idea of our leader being called the president, someone actually said, well, somebody asked them, they debated this. They debated, what are we going to call him? How are we going to address him? And someone actually suggested, His Majesty. And someone else said, no. We don't want it to even sound like there's a king. And it was settled on Mr. President. That's how he's to be addressed. Even though we take a lot of pride in all that, do you realize that the 535, 9, 1, 2, and then all the people that work for him, but just take those, whatever that turns into 550 people or so that run this nation, want to be catered to and taken care of and provided for by the people, rather than asking themselves, how can we serve the people, make their lives better, and empower them and protect them. And if they understood this principle, that's the way that they would exercise their authority, is our job is to be shepherds over this nation. The nation isn't here to serve me. We're here to serve the nation. Got to stop. Clock says I have to. Don't really want to. But anyway, we'll continue this. We're going to look at Psalm 23 going forward. We're going to look at Matthew 2 and John 10 and Hebrews 13 and a bunch of other passages. But Psalm 23 is going to be the next block of text that we look at. What a beautiful, beautiful passage of Scripture. Picturing the Lord as a shepherd. And if the Lord is our shepherd, then does anybody really think that their authority should be anything different than that? Got to stop. Thanks a lot.